Hi, First Draft Club listeners, and hi if you're watching on YouTube. Happy 2025. This is our first episode of 2025. And today I'm talking about how to write a timeless novel, whatever that means. I confess that the title of this episode is sort of tongue-in-cheek because I find the idea of trying to write a timeless book to be a little silly, but it comes up a surprising amount. And I do want to actually entertain this question seriously because I think there actually is a really good question at the heart of it. So I'm going to talk about it today while also poking a little fun at it. I think the better question, that is a better question than how to write a timeless book, is how to write a novel that doesn't have a super short shelf life, right? Now, an example of a book from, my recent life history that I think has an incredibly long shelf life is Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Louis Sachar. Now, this is a series of books that are written for middle grade children. It's a series that I read as a child and that I recently read. I read all of them aloud to my almost 7-year-old. Despite most of these being written in the 70s, the 1970s, they hold up so well. I found them funny still. My son found them hilarious. We were so disappointed when we made it through the entire series. So what makes a series like that hold up? Now, I know that's a book that's a series written for children, but, I'm sure we can all think of examples in our own lives. There are plenty of, just look to classic literature, right? Like literature that stands the test of time. In this episode, I'm going to talk about why timelessness does not really make sense to me as a goal, why we can't avoid our stories having timestamps and shouldn't try to avoid our stories having timestamps, and why ironically allowing them to have timestamps but being thoughtful about what those are can potentially extend the shelf life of the story you're writing. Let's go. First, the reason timelessness doesn't make sense to me as a goal. Let's talk about that. Quick story, a few years ago, I was in a playwriting 101 class. By a few years ago, I mean like 15 years ago. It was literally called that, Playwriting 101. This was for beginners. I was a beginner. I assumed that the other people in the class were also beginners. And fittingly, on the first day of class, the instructor gave us a lesson on dialogue, and he was talking about how people don't say what they mean, right? Like really one of the most fundamental principles of writing good dialogue, by the way, whether you're writing prose or drama. And so it was fundamental. It was really clarifying for me. I was excited. I was listening. I was engaged. A woman in the class raised her hand. I remember her very vividly because she was wearing a fedora. Of course she was. She interrupted the lecture to ask, how does one write a play that's timeless? First of all, this is one of my pet peeves when someone interrupts a discussion or lecture to derail it with a completely irrelevant question. Like it's not respectful of the person who is teaching or the people who are following the lesson. But also, I suppressed a giggle because we were talking about how to understand the basic tenets of believable dialogue. Like I wasn't even close to being ready to start thinking about the timelessness of the play I was going to write any more than I was ready to go out and buy my evening gown for the Tony Award I was going to win. I don't mean to be catty. I just mean there are so many things we already have to be thinking about when we're writing a novel or, in that case, a play, when we're working on a first draft. It's giving yourself way too much multitasking to do and avoidable mental work to be thinking about step 200 when you are still at step 2. So timelessness in that sense, I just think is like something you get to take off your plate. But over the years, as I went on to write and publish several novels and then started teaching novel writing, I found that a version of this question that is on people's minds and that I think is fair is how can I avoid dating my novel? That is what people will often say. How can I avoid dating my novel? I've been asked that a number of times. And I have a very simple answer, which is that you can't and you shouldn't try. And here's why. For a number of reasons, it is impossible for you to avoid dating your novel. Okay, technology alone, right? Technology moves way too fast, particularly over the last century, which is the period in which 95% of novels are set. During this period of time, technological progress has been exponential. So for us to write any story from anywhere from the early 1900s to today, and try for it not to have inherently like a timestamp, we're going to fail. We just will. Are your people driving in cars? Are they flying in planes? What kind of cars? If they're flying, is there TSA? And what does the TSA experience look like? Because pre-2011 and post-2011, those look very different. You know, the obvious one, ubiquitously, are they texting? How are they texting? What kind of phones do they have? Are they answering a landline? Are they on social media platforms, and what kind? Are their headphones corded or wireless? You can try to make these choices generic in order to avoid your work having a particular, period of about 3 to 4 years that it falls into. But this is going to be a bad choice because specifics are what makes good writing, right? We have a whole lesson about this in the book incubator that Rufi Thorpe, who teaches with me in the incubator, teaches. If you try to remove specifics, the writing will suffer. It is very much not worth it. I can tell when I am reading work by a new writer who is attempting to avoid giving their work a timestamp. It is inferior writing. The way I notice is I will start to notice like a lack of detail, a tendency to overgeneralize the technology in particular. And when I ask about it, they'll say, well, I'm trying not to date the novel. This does it a disservice, okay? Details are not only good, they are critical. And details date things. Details are critical and details date things. Not just technology, right? We have slang, fashion, the kinds of specifics that you're going to actively want to put into your writing, because this is what makes stories feel real. And these are the kind of details that will also convey a time period. And by time period, I mean, again, like a period of about 3 to 4 years in any given direction, kind of as a general rule of thumb. Now, this, of course, is going to exclude kind of exceptional moments in history where there's like some kind of major event. A war, a pandemic, in which case, the timestamp will be narrower. Most importantly in this episode, I want to debunk the idea that this is a bad thing. Your goal is not to write a story that could be set in any time. No one is looking for that when they're looking for a good book, right? Classic literature is not classic because you can't tell if it happened in 1825 or 1940. It's classic because it is very clearly set in 1825 or 1940. Like, does anyone read The Great Gatsby and go, oh my God, I love that because I feel like it could have been in the 80s? Like, no. So my advice is to go to the other extreme. When I am working on a first novel draft, I am cognizant of precisely the date the story is taking place, down to the month. This is July 2019, or this is November 1953. And I do end up shifting these dates around through the process of writing and revising over months and months, just because of the natural evolution of the project. Sometimes I will realize that certain large-scale events either get in the way of the story I'm telling, or alternatively could serve the story I'm telling. And so it makes sense to migrate the date a few years or months. For example, when I was working on my second novel, Privilege, which is about a sexual assault on a college campus, in the midst of working on it, the Me Too movement was really taking off. And so I had to make a choice. Did I want to set my novel before, during, or after, like the heyday of the Me Too movement? I remember carefully weighing the pros and cons of each of those, those choices and how they would affect the narrative. Because if I set it during the movement would need to be a more integral part of the story versus if they were looking back on it, or of course, if it hadn't happened yet. And so the question for me became, as the author, like, which choice would most assist me in exploring the big question that my novel was orbiting versus like which choice would not serve it or potentially distract from it. And that was my call as the author. So If the key to writing a good book with a decent shelf life is not avoiding timestamps, which I hope I've persuaded you, what is it? Why do Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Louis Sachar work so well 50 years after he wrote them? Don't hate me for saying this next part. I realize this is sort of obvious and obnoxiously trite, but you want to write a story that has universal human struggle at the heart of it. That easy thing. So there's that. But I want to be a little bit more specific and helpful than that. So I think a potentially actionable rule of thumb is to be aware of slang, actions, and trends that are rooted in the bias and the biases that existed at the time period where your book is set. Okay? In spite of everything happening in the world right now, I know there's people listening who are going to disagree with this next statement. Society does tend to progress in a more just direction. Okay, I believe that. Feel free to disagree. There's substantial evidence, there are books written on this, that the arc of the universe does bend toward justice. Does it go there as quickly as we would like? Absolutely not. Are there setbacks? Yes. Are there exceptions? Yes. But in general, society tends to progress in a more just direction. What do I mean by that? I mean, we realize that certain terms are not terms that we should call people. We realize that certain rights are the kind of rights that belong to all people. As realizations, kind of collective realizations and codification of these realizations happens, viewpoints become outdated. And books that incorporate these outdated viewpoints in a way that either seems to celebrate them or that fails to present them as a problem are going to feel as outdated as the viewpoints that they contain. Now, I am not saying that you need to pretend a city in America in 1950 wasn't overtly, legally racist. You don't need to write Jim Crow laws out of your book. You shouldn't write them out of your book if your book is set during that time period. Revisit the first half of this episode about timestamps. But there is a way to write in racism, for example, that acknowledges it for what it is. And there's a way to write it, in such a way that like a Jim Crow apologist might have in the 50s. Basically, I think this is a challenge to, step away from the racism example and think about it more broadly now. I think this is a kind of challenge for our imagination, which of course is like what we do as writers, we imagine. And so imagine the future world that your book will exist in 50 years from now. Are there parts of your story that a reader might look back at and go, yikes, that is not how we talk about or to people now? And if so, can you edit that passage so that what you sense is problematic about it is captured there? It's in the text or the subtext. It's in a character's outlook. It's in the vibe. It's in the tone. To summarize, I do think the way to write a story that has a long shelf life is to have an underlying big question that is thorny and human and ethical and emotional and touches on something that is resonant across culture and time. And this is why the big question, I call it, is the first thing that I teach in the incubator. So happy writing. Don't be shy about dating your stories, and I will see you next episode. Thanks for being here.